And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, welcome back to the podcast if you are a return listener, and welcome to the podcast if you are a first-time listener. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of TeachThought Professional Development. And a few housekeeping notes to mention. We are in the final week of our Lead Thoughts and Teach Thoughts series, which is a free one-pager that shows up in your email inbox every Sunday. And this Sunday will be the last of that installment, but there is still time if you are interested in signing up. And you'll get that last email with links to the previous 5 weeks of one-pagers as well. You can find that by going to wegrowteachers.com/thoughts. Also, as a reminder, we of course offer professional development in lots of different areas: project-based learning, differentiated instruction, assessment, literacy, and other things that are more leadership and collaboration. I'll remind folks, if you are looking to grow your school in a more long-term sustainable plan and work, that could include our PLC work as well as our collaborative lesson study work. And so if you're interested in professional development, whether it's a short-term or the longer-term, more sustainable that we advocate for, please feel free to reach out to me at drew@teachthought.com. You can always, of course, go to wegrowteachers.com and see all of our offerings and our workshops and services and submit a request for more information there, and which you can schedule a call with me there. We look forward to working with you. In this episode, I spoke with Mary Pulido, who's the Executive Director for the New York Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And we started our conversation talking about the somewhat recent episode that some of you may have seen of, I think, the 6-year-old in Florida being spanked by a school administrator and or teacher. And so that was the beginning of our conversation. And some of it, and actually quite a bit of it, lingered on the corporal punishment issue and some of the complexities around that. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, she made a distinction between child abuse and neglect. And we talked about the role of trauma and emotional health in the process of dealing with kids and discipline and those kinds of issues. And we ended our conversation talking about the role of teachers in reporting and recognizing some abuse or neglect issues, including some of the things that might keep them from reporting them, like anxiety about starting a process that might get out of control and or might not actually be a real issue. So that may have been one of the biggest takeaways and things that teachers might want to think about as they navigate the role of trauma, abuse, and neglect in and with our students. So I hope it's helpful. All right, Mary, we are live and connected here via Zoom. You're joining me from the Bronx, the Boogie Down Bronx, right? That's what they say, the kids say these days. And we're going to talk about your work with the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, NYSPCC. Not to be confused with, what is the ASPCA, or there's something with Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and you probably...
The ASPCA, and I will talk about that briefly.
Okay. So I'm going to, as I like to do, give you an opportunity to introduce yourself so that folks have an idea of who they are listening to, and then we'll get into the meat of our conversation.
Thank you, Drew. I'm Dr. Mary Pulido. I'm the Executive Director of the New York Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which is in New York City. And it's the first child protection agency in the world. And so we were founded in 1875 by the ASPCA attorneys, which is why I'm going to just mention that, because our history is really fascinating, and we do hold the archives for the child protection movement in the United States. But in 1875, there was a little girl in Hell's Kitchen here in New York that was being horribly abused by a caretaker. And a church volunteer named Etta Wheeler didn't know who to go to, but she knew this little girl was being beaten and whipped and really had horrific injuries. And there were laws to protect animals in 1875, but there were no laws to protect children. So she went to the ASPCA. She went to two attorneys, Henry Berg and Elbridge Gary, and said, what do I do? And they went in and had some of their men rescue little Mary Ellen. And then they prosecuted the case based on the laws that were written for animals. And then they started the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, and Elbridge Gary founded the agency. And then we wrote the basic laws that underpin the entire child protection movement that now is, in every single state of the United States. But we did all of the removal work and the investigation work in New York City until the 1970s when the government took over. So today, fast forward to 2021, I have a clinic that is seeing children who are recovering from physical abuse, sexual abuse, witnessing the homicide of a parent in our trauma recovery program. We have what's called a therapeutic supervised visitation program for parents who are not allowed to see their children unless there's a therapist in the room guiding the interaction due to issues of domestic violence, mental illness, substance abuse, child abuse, and neglect. Normally a combination of all those areas. And we also do tremendous amount of prevention work in the New York City public school system. We're in the schools every single day. And during the pandemic, we've been in the schools almost every single day virtually with our Safe Touches child sex abuse prevention program. And it's one of the only evidence-based programs in the United States for children from kindergarten through the third grade. Where children learn what parts of their body are private, what are safe and not safe touches, who's allowed to touch them and under what circumstances, what to do if they get a touch that feels icky and uncomfortable, and who can they tell. And we teach them safety tools, and we teach the teachers how to address concerns, and we work with the parents. So it's sort of a comprehensive view of preventing child sex abuse. And that program is actually being replicated right now in other states and actually in the country of Greece. So we're very proud of it. But we do a lot of work to support teachers and educators in helping them work with children and talking about these difficult issues in the classroom.
So the issue, or I guess the story, for lack of a better term, that brought you and I across each other's radar was, or is, the 6-year-old girl in Florida being paddled. And I'm only vaguely familiar with it because I didn't actually dive into it and watch the video and things like that. I am aware that those things happen, and actually what strikes me as interesting is I think you probably can talk more about, is that it is actually legal in quite a few states, and how that breakdown goes. But I guess give a little bit, if you would, sort of fill in some of the gaps on that story, and to the extent that you all have done any work on that or similar cases, and what that, I guess, maybe the trajectory of those laws and incidents relating to those laws have been over the I guess number of decades that you may have been involved in this.
Hey, sure. I did watch the video. I watched the video several times, and it was horrible to watch. Mm-hmm. And I'm involved in the New York Society for Prevention of Cruelty is involved in both a national initiative to end corporal punishment of children, And I'm also on the National Board of Directors for the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, where we are working and advocating very strenuously to try to end corporal punishment in schools. And there still are, I want to say it's like 17 or 19 states that still allow corporal punishment in schools. Though we are working, as I said, all the time, because when a child is, first of all, if someone hit an adult or walked up and took a paddle, and that was a big paddle, and started beating an adult, what would happen? You'd get arrested. You'd call the police. But the thought that people can beat a child and it is still fine, and that was in my mind, it was a severe beating. It's paramount. If it leaves a bruise, that's one of the things that should be reported. I would be shocked if something like that didn't leave a bruise, but I know it's working its way through all the investigations, and there's been a lot of feedback, I think, to the school system, and hopefully that behavior will stop and that we won't see incidences like that, what that video showed. But children don't learn from being hit. Children learn from discipline. Children learn from being taught, this is not what I'd like you to do, so you're going to have a timeout. This is the behavior I would like you to try to do. What happens when a parent or a teacher loses control and starts beating a child, or paddling a child or whipping a child, whatever the object is they have in their hand, all that does is create anger and upset and terror in the child. It doesn't teach the proper behavior, and it also, when you're just looking at trying to get the reaction you want, if someone does violence towards you, it doesn't normally change what you're doing. It normally makes you afraid, or it makes you angry, or it makes you vindictive, or you in turn become aggressive, or it could do the opposite. It could make you depressed. It could make you, very for a child, it can make you clingy. It can make you anxious. You could lose sleep. You could do poorly in school. So what we've known, and the research bears this out, because I have research that could fill the room you're in on what the dangers of corporal punishment. I have never in my career, and I've been in this field for over 35 years, read one article that shows corporal punishment is good for children. And I'm just talking about the symptoms that children exhibit after being hit, and the reason, you have to look at, why do people have to resort to that type of behavior, in a classroom to control children. You would really hope that there's better strategies for people to be able to put in place. And that means they need to be taught those strategies. So teachers need that type of support. But beyond that, you also have to look at the physical ramifications of what happens when a child is hurt, and the cortisol that their body is putting out, and then what happens to your body on cortisol, and how that changes your reactions to other things and makes you in this state of hyper alert. And it also, there's research coming out that shows it impacts how children's brains develop. And it makes sense when children are in a high state of alert, a high state of stress. Abused children, which is the area that I've been dealing with my whole life, have often very overactive systems because they're always on alert. They're never sure if they're safe. And we don't want to do that in the classroom. We don't want children to worry about not being safe. We want children to be in an environment where they can learn. So the National Initiative to End Corporal Punishment has a website with all sorts of resources, as does the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. And I would encourage people to go to those websites and really delve in and look. The other thing I'm going to raise quickly, because I know I don't want to spend all our time just on corporal punishment, but there's another movement in the United States of which I am a part of, and the NYSPCC is a part of it. It's called Establishing No-Hit Zones. And no-hit zones have flourished. And I want to say they started with a colleague of mine's really pushing it, Stacy LeBlanc, in the state of Louisiana. But now they're throughout many states in the nation. And it goes under there's 4 tenets. No adult should hit another adult. No adult should hit a child. No child should hit an adult, and no child should hit another child. And then there's a toolkit for there's a toolkit for parents, there's a toolkit for agencies, there's a toolkit for, that providers in schools and hospitals can use. And it's when you see these behaviors, because people are sometimes afraid to intervene and say, oh no, stop. They're afraid of pushback. But if you are a no-hit zone, then you can say to whoever is acting out, oh, I'm sorry, we don't do that here. We're a no-hit zone. Let me explain what that means. And then we actually give people the language to explain, why there's a policy of not hitting anyone while they're in the agency or the hospital or the church, whatever it is. And I think that that's another positive way of both teaching people how to intervene in a good way, not being judgmental, and making people feel guilty that that maybe they hit their child in public. Because what we're saying is, we don't do that here, and let's give you some tools so that hopefully you can find a better way not to hit your child when they're doing something you don't like. So I would say those 2 websites in the No Hit Zone website would be great resources for teachers too.
So there's several things that strike me as complexities to this issue as you talk about it, and even if you'll indulge me in some like devil's advocacy, because I'm sure you've have encountered some of it at least, right? Some pushback or some people saying, essentially disagreeing, right? But I would imagine the case that we talked about is in school, and so making a different or distinguishing between any of the discipline and disciplinary measures and best practices or suggestions, recommendations, how we deal with the discipline, or however you want to label that process in schools versus parents. And then, so we've got schools and teachers and administrators doing corporal punishment or any discipline really, versus me as a parent or you as a parent or any parents, right, in the home, and how that might look different. And then, the spectrum, I would imagine, of, first of all, how you might label or how you define any sort of corporal punishment. Clearly spanking would fall into that, or are there sort of gradations of things that fall in that category, as well as how do we define abuse versus maybe isolated acts. So I suppose maybe let's start with that distinction, perhaps, or if you see much of a distinction between discipline and the roles of the various players in schools versus parents, and what that looks like for you all.
I mean, I definitely think that there's differences. I want to go back to what you said about corporal punishment versus child abuse versus neglect, whatever. I want to talk about those 3, and then we can talk about parents versus teachers as well. But when you're talking about child abuse, if something rises to when there's an investigation and they're labeling it abuse, and I want to talk about child abuse and neglect as being at opposite ends of the continuum, because people lump them together. And they're 2 very different things. Child abuse is when someone takes an action to deliberately harm a child. it is intentional. All right, someone is beating a child, someone is kicking a child, putting a cigarette burn on a child, someone is sexually abusing a child, but it's intentional, and there's an intent to cause harm to the child, and that's considered abuse. And there could be emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, but the physical abuse normally leaves marks. You can see, grip marks. You can see bruises in different stages of healing. Child sexual abuse does not usually leave a lot of evidence, which is part of the reason why it's hard to have medical evidence of child sexual abuse. Emotional abuse, the same thing, but parents can say horrible things that can be psychologically damaging to children. But it's with the intent to do harm. Neglect, child neglect, on the other hand, is when parents are not doing or caretakers are not doing what's needed for a child to thrive. So it's the absence of action. Their children are being left alone in a home, unsupervised. Children are not going to school every day. Children don't have the food that they need to thrive. Children are sick and they're not getting medical attention. So that's neglect. So there's the continuum. It goes from you're doing something intentionally with the intent to cause harm to a child to you're not doing something and you're causing harm to a child. So I do want to make that continuum clear, because I just find that very often in people's minds, it's child abuse and neglect, and they're very different. And children die from both. The majority of children are removed for child neglect, not child abuse. And the majority of children are reunited after the issues of child neglect are addressed. Corporal punishment is in the United States right now. I mean, it's still accepted, and as I said, in several states in the schools, parents can practice corporal punishment. We advise them to try to move, as I said, to no hit zones and discipline. But that's where someone is using something to to try to do, you're paddling the child with, and it can be, the paddle that we saw, it can be, a ruler that is used, it can be a utensil, but it's something that people are using to try to teach the child a lesson. It's not neglect, it's not abuse, but it's closer to, I would say, let me put it this way, it can escalate into abuse quickly, which is why we really are trying to find a way to give teachers and parents other tools. I sat on the child fatality review team in New York City for 10 years, and I had to review cases of child physical abuse, and I had to review cases in my mind where the corporal punishment went off the charts and the child was fatally injured. Because sometimes people can lose control. An adult has so much more power than a little child, and they may not realize the force that they're using, and that force can get out of control and really injure the child and cross that line. Abuse is when something leaves a mark. If your corporal punishment may probably not, if it's being, just a quick tap on the butt or a slap on the hand, that probably won't leave a mark. Slapping will not leave a mark. Something that where it's over and over with an object could leave a mark. And if something leaves a mark, then it turns from, that's that stage where, child abuse, when you're looking at physical abuse, does leave marks on children. And then the other thing too is when you're just looking at child abuse, when a child, and teachers should always, they're reporters of child abuse. So there's, you want to make sure the children are safe and healthy. But when teachers see a child that, when a child falls or a child gets hurt or a child's roughhousing or a child falls off their bike, where do they scrape? They scrape their hands, they scrape their knees, they scrape their elbows. But if you see bruises on a child or injuries on a child that are on their neck or that are on their chest or maybe on the upper arms, those are also, in my mind, if you see finger grips on a child's arm, those are things that need to be explored, and teachers need to sort of be on the lookout. But that's why I really think, when you look at the continuum and then you look at paddling or hitting or whooping a child, where, it gets so close to, if it goes too far, what the negative consequences can be for that child. We really want to try to find peaceful, calm ways of working with parents and working with teachers so that corporal punishment isn't needed.
Yeah, it doesn't strike me as ever really appropriate. And I grew up in, I'm 51. I don't know your age, but my guess is you had some experience in schools as I did. I remember that being, the principal's paddle with the holes in it and, those kinds of memes, I guess, and the threat of that being sent to the principal's office, and which doesn't necessarily mean you were going to get paddled, but there was that threat. And there are, I'm sure, still advocates for that as an option in our schools. I can't see how that could reasonably be justified as a role, like that the school teacher or administrator, first of all, would want to be in that position. That seems like a very uncomfortable and terrible place to be. But even if that is, putting that aside, the idea that is the person who should be the one to, deliver that discipline, whether it's paddling or yelling at or whatever version of that stern talking to or something. I mean, certainly some stern talking to is I would say appropriate in a school setting. I remember my brother, who's 5 years older than me, coming home and my mother was a teacher and a principal, and my dad was a psychologist. And to be fair, they spanked both of us as kids, but not to anything that would have left marks or bruising or anything like that. But that my brother came home after being paddled by a school official, and he had those sort of bruises or welts or things like that, and that was certainly beyond the pale. But I'm imagining that you have had multiple conversations of folks who say, that there are some acceptable instances of parents and spanking or some version of that. And so how do you think through those conversations?
I did put out a blog a while back that I'd be happy to send you to put up, and it's called "Spare the Rod, Save the Child." Because when you look at all the things I talked about earlier regarding the reaction of the child to being hit, to being paddled, we know that it's not going to necessarily give the parents the result that they want long term. It may not even give the parents the result that they want short term, but it will make the child possibly stop. It will make the child afraid. But the research has also showed that it also produces long-term depression in children, aggression in children, bullying in children. And parents, when we sit down and really talk with them about the no hit zones, because this goes back to giving, you can't just say don't hit your child. You have to give parents alternatives. What do you do? How do you go from hitting a child to giving them a timeout or taking away privileges or saying, or just trying when they're yelling or screaming in the grocery store that they want something to remain calm when everyone is staring at you. It's not easy, but you can make good choices, and you can do things where eventually, hopefully, your child is then going to respond differently to words than to actions. Because when you hit, you're teaching a child to hit. You're teaching, your children repeat your behavior. And we really don't want another cycle of adults hitting children and children growing up and hitting children. And interestingly, the United States is many countries have banned corporal punishment. Many countries have banned corporal punishment. We're a little bit behind the curve. And our hope is that we can get up to where I get an email almost every day on amazing things, because I'm on the National Initiative to End Corporal Punishment. And it's like amazing to me that the United States is still not there. But we know that that children will thrive. Children's mental health will be better. Their physical health will be better. They'll be able to concentrate better if they're not hit. And I have had many adults who were hit as children say to me, I wish there were no hit zones when I was a child, because I was brutally hit and I wanted someone to intervene, and I was sad that someone did not intervene. And it's, and it's difficult because a lot of us were, had spankings, and people said I was spanked and I turned out okay. And there is that side of the argument. But what we're saying is we're really trying to take that hitting and that violence, because the research has shown, we now have research. When I was a child, you was a child, there weren't a lot of research out there saying these are the long-term impacts of what happens every time you spank a child. This is how the cortisol spikes. This is what it does to their nervous system or their brain, or aggression and bullying that can come from it in later years. But now we do have that research. And the research unequivocally says, try to find other ways of changing your child's behavior, of working with them, so that you're not causing them harm and they're not going to repeat that cycle. Because I do think children repeat what they know, and what we're really trying to do is give parents better tools, and there's an entire and I love the handouts that go with the no hit zone, because it gives parents, if your child is doing this, do this, and it gives you things from the infants to toddlers to kindergartners, and it goes by ages all the way up in small segments, so that parents can actually have different things to say, different ideas to try. Because again, we have to give parents tools on what to do. And in the moment when the parents are stressed, and right now in the pandemic, we have parents stressed. There are economic insecurities, there's food insecurities, there's employment insecurities. And the same thing goes with teachers. Teachers also have, in my mind now, a tremendous amount of stressors, and teachers need a lot of support. And with all the children in New York City now, we're all going back into the classroom. And I've been doing webinars with the Department of Education on stress and coping for teachers and counselors throughout the pandemic. And I think, support for teachers is really needed, because they are not only dealing with the trauma that they may have gone through with COVID and all the stresses that they're under, but now they have all the children coming back into the classroom, and they also are going to have to deal with all the children's trauma and everything that the children went through with COVID. And consequently, stress levels are high. And when stress levels are high, and if corporal punishment is allowed, I'm just saying that's where things can swing towards that end of the continuum, where the paddling gets too much, where the spanking gets too much, or the whooping gets too much. And I really encourage, the schools to support teachers, to help them deal with their stress and give them work with them on other methods of disciplining children. As I said, the United States is one of the last frontiers in countries where we should be leading and saying we have no corporal punishment in the schools, and we're not. But I do want to focus on just for a minute the concept of shared trauma that the pandemic has brought. That I really do feel strongly we need to do more to support teachers as they go back into the classroom. Because when you look at COVID and all of the losses, where we sometimes just feel that we're focusing on the children, but the teachers have lost loved ones. The teachers may have family members that have COVID or are recovering. The teachers anyone that works in the school system, may also have family members that are unemployed, food insecurity, a lot of worries about getting COVID, taking it home to their loved ones. And not everyone is vaccinated, so there's a lot of stressors on the adults and the educators and everyone that works in the schools right now as we gear back up. So they do need support. But then the children are also going to need support. And it's very difficult to support someone that's going through a traumatic experience when you're also going through the traumatic experience. And that's called shared trauma. So we have, educators and school personnel going back into the schools, and we have children that are going back to the schools, many of whom have been impacted negatively by the pandemic. And so I really encourage schools to try to do things to offer extra support for their teachers in workshops on stress and coping skills, and even helping them identify how are they coping. And that was one of the things I did in my workshop. Is it maladaptive? Is it adaptive? What are they doing? What types of support are they being offered? What can they do for self-care when they're not on the clock to help rejuvenate and come back restored? But I do think that this time is very different than any other time in the United States, that we really need to boost and support everyone that's working with children who have been impacted more than ever before. And I know I was just asked to join a work group in New York City because there have been so many deaths due to COVID, and we're trying to figure out how can we best support the children the children who have lost a parent. And we're looking at resources that are available, but we're also looking at how do we identify them. And one of the ways that they're going to be identifiable is through the schools. And if that's so, then what supports will we be offering in the schools, both for the teachers and for the children? But it's a, I think, unique time in history where we really need to look at increasing as much as possible the supports for educators and teachers who are doing such critical work. I teach at the master's level at CUNY, and I know just teaching through Zoom for this last year with the pandemic, how worried I got about students when I felt that they weren't looking as bright as they normally do, and how difficult it is to follow up on everything through Zoom. And I'm working with people that are adults, and we did do a lot of work with helping teachers try to figure out danger signs for children. But now that children are all going to be back in the classroom and bringing with them a year and a half almost of all of the devastation of the pandemic, I think we need to support teachers even more. Yeah, my hat's off to teachers. I think they're amazing. I have a master's degree in teaching. I can't say enough good things about teachers. I know we're talking about paddling and corporal punishment, but I am a huge fan of teachers and the work that they do every day, because they're really expected to wear so many hats. And I mean, in New York City, our children are coming in with lots of issues that are going on in their household. And very often the teachers are the ones that are on the front line trying to identify all the issues that are going on with the children and trying to get them help. And they really need more support doing that. We need more support in the schools, more counselors, more social workers. But my hat's off to everyone in the education system.
Well, it is a really difficult job to do well, and we talk about that quite a bit on the podcast. And I actually have had several recent conversations around SEL, social emotional learning, and one of the things that I have real concerns about is the what feels like a continued addition to the job of being, in some ways, in this context, a proxy for what probably, or at least seems to me, to be something that, while not absent from a teacher's plate and teacher's job, but teachers should be teaching and focusing on teaching and doing clinical social work at the same time is it makes it increasingly difficult. And it brings me to the emotional health and emotional IQ issue. And it strikes me as something that is absolutely vitally important, and I don't want to linger or relitigate or talk necessarily too much about the corporal punishment issue, but it does strike me as an interesting question around, because as you mentioned, the idea that many of us were spanked, and I was spanked, and there certainly, I don't disagree that there's research that shows long-term effects, and that is a truth and empirically true. But then again, there are folks that, as you mentioned, like, oh, well, I turned out okay, and I could make that argument as well. Like, I didn't have depression or lots of issues. I mean, we all have emotional things that we work through, right? And so I wonder about how any of the role of sort of emotional health and IQ in any sort of interaction with kids, whether it's corporal punishment or neglect or child abuse, as you make that distinction, I think that is useful. And especially with corporal punishment, like doing that out of anger or doing it in a much more, let's say, dispassionate way, whether that's, again, corporal punishment or whether it's verbal, and that could be verbal abuse, right? I mean, some of that can happen, and that's outside of the realm of corporal punishment. And so to me, one of the first order issues that we are really need to get a better handle on, and I would think would really help with some of these abuse and or neglect issues, is the emotional health of people, and being able to, like, the anxiety and insecurities and lack of emotional health that I perceive as a real crisis in this country. Those are the kinds of factors in my mind that lead to the abuses, whether they're corporal punishment or not. So I know you have some of your work deals in clinical pieces and certainly gets into the realm of social work, but like, how do you think about that social and emotional health issue?
A few things are going through my mind when you were talking about this right now. The first, is that in New York City, during the pandemic, before the pandemic and during the pandemic, one of the things that I think was a good move was that mental health services funding was put towards making them more readily available and normalizing them for people, so that people felt less of a stigma of reaching out. And, there's different programs, like in New York City, there's one called Thrive, but it was basically helping people get access to mental health services when they need them. There were hotlines put in place. You can get a counselor through chat. You can get a counselor through your phone, teletherapy. Everything sort of really, I think, became easier access, less worrisome for people, because people were stigma. It was sort of like right after 9/11, I was part of Project Liberty, the recovery effort in 9/11, where Project Liberty was mental health services free of cost for anyone that went through or was having reactions to the terrorist attacks. And it was one of the few times in my memory where people were like, yeah, I'm not feeling good. I'm really depressed. I'm anxious. I can't sleep. I'm snapping at everyone. I need to call this number. I need to get some support. And it was commercials and it was normalized, and people that would never have accessed mental health accessed it. And in New York City, I know that there was a big push and many commercials and different ways of advertising. Many people are feeling these stressors. Many people are lashing out. And if you notice this is happening, there's help for you. And I think that that has to happen across the board in all states. But I really encourage people in every single webinar I teach to take advantage of it. If you used to have, or you had a therapist you liked, or you used to go to a group, or you used to do something with teletherapy, I call them booster shots. I said, look, you don't have to go back into long-term therapy. Go for a booster shot. Talk to someone if you're not feeling good. Talk to someone that can give you ideas on how to handle situations differently and normalize and validate what you're going through. I mean, so I think that that's one area that I feel we need to do more. And we need, just because the numbers are going down and the vaccines are rolling out, I think there's going to be long-term implications for people and just their anxiety of trying to get back to whatever the new normal is, and being around people again, no masks again. It's going to be a transition process that I think is going to heighten anxiety for a while, and then hopefully that will level off. But I do think accessing mental health services is key. And I think it has to be, again, normalized and validated, and you need it and you should have it, and it's healthy, and it will help you, and it will help anyone that you're dealing with in your family or your job or whatever. But the other issue that sprang to mind is the issue when you're talking about the impact of children. It's called, and I'm sure you probably heard of the research, and I do delve into it actually in the courses that I teach at the school, Silberman School of Social Work. It's ACEs, the adverse experiences that children have. It's an ACEs survey, adverse childhood experiences. And they're things like witnessing domestic violence. Were you psychologically abused? Were you maltreated? And the ACEs study has shown that, did you have it goes through, did you have a parent that was incarcerated? Was people in your house ever arrested? Were people using drugs? Were you ever, sexually abused, physically abused? Did you watch your parent being hit by another parent? There's a list of questions. And they also covered, psychological abuse is also, in there. And then what they looked at with this huge study, and they followed adults, was that their lifelong trajectory, both for school, education, and work, the more ACEs that they had, the more of these negative experiences, the more health issues they had, the less successful they were in school, the less successful they were in a career. And now there's really a big push to try to identify ACEs in children and in adults, and because we want to eliminate them. We want to find ways so that children have healthier childhoods, so children aren't abused, so that children can thrive, so that trajectory that should be going up is not tanking, because we do know trauma is cumulative. And the more traumas that children experience, the more that impacts their mental health, their physical health, their sense of well-being. And what we really want for our children, and we want for adults, is to have a good sense of well-being. So all of the ACEs research, when you look at that, along with the corporal punishment research, it all points to we need to find ways to support parents, support families, support anyone that's working with children, and reduce the incidence of things that children can perceive as being traumatic. That was a long answer to that question. but those were the two areas that my mind went to immediately, was the ACEs research and the Thrive and the different programs that are out there now to support people in the moment at the pandemic, because it's been a long haul and everyone needs support.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things before we before we sign off is thinking about how or what are some of the things, because we've certainly talked about corporal punishment, but that is not the only thing, and perhaps not even, I guess, probably very likely not the most common kind of issue that you deal with. And so when teachers are operating, I would imagine most teachers have an understanding that they have a duty and an obligation. I myself have had that opportunity, or not opportunity, certainly that's the wrong word, but I've had the instance where I have had to report a something that was not above board, or I didn't think it was above board and ended up not being above board. And so, what are the ways in which, or I guess the things that you would share with teachers to be, I suppose, on the lookout for signs, characteristics, things, some things clearly obvious, right? Bruises or things like that, but it's a little tougher when you see some student who might be withdrawn and or anxious, or some visible emotional kinds of mental health issues, but attributing it to something that is abuse or neglect is perhaps a little bit more of a link or a jump, and perhaps even a little scary, because you say, well, I'm reporting something that very well could be not a big deal and or nothing at all. In particular, maybe the student is just experiencing some issues for a variety of reasons that could be the case. So how do you talk with teachers or recommend that they navigate that landscape?
Well, I think we're moving out of virtual, and there were different, I gave tips in the blog that TeachThought put up about what to look for virtually. But if we're talking about going back into the classroom, just as you said, with the physical abuse, it's people are still hesitant. By the way, the majority of people do not want to report. We just did a national survey, and 71% of Americans expressed hesitancy about wanting to report abuse because they were afraid they would make it worse for the child, or they were afraid that they would be retaliated against, or they were afraid that they said it's none of their business. So I think that's a big nut to crack. And teachers, mandated reporters have the obligation to report abuse. But I think you're also looking for changes in the demeanor of a child. If a child was always upbeat and happy and did their work and came to school, ready to go, and then all of a sudden you're noticing changes, you can do a check-in with the child. You can say, how are things at home? How are you doing? Tell me about, what do you do when you leave here? How do you spend your day? I mean, there's ways of eliciting questions to get more information from the child. And then I think, there's also, if you are concerned about a child, if a child is depressed and there is a counselor in the school, you should be talking to the counselor about doing a check-in with the parents. If the child was always getting good grades and the grades are dropping, you do want to find out what has changed. Has something changed at home? Because it could be they lost a parent from COVID, right. And it could be they need support, and it could be they don't have the other thing that I think teachers should be aware of is you may be seeing more neglect. I know that's one of the things that we're concerned about in this work group that we're in, because if a child normally had a parent who made sure they had clean clothes to wear, who made sure they had, dinner every night, who made sure they did their homework, and all of a sudden that parent isn't there anymore and they have to go back to school, there are going to be, I think, substantive changes that teachers are going to have to, they're playing a very important role in identifying the needs of the child and trying to then get I'm hopeful, the referrals set up in place so that the children, we can find out how are they impacted, how can we help them get the support that they need. Because you said it, the teachers it's double duty. Their job is to teach, but they're also, I think, just their empathy and their concern always moves to a level of, let me find out what's wrong with this child because it's going to bother them, and I always say, go with your gut. If you think there's something wrong, there probably is. Well, and I just think that's a good rule for people to keep in mind.
Yeah. So as you're talking, I'm remembering as a teacher, I was in the classroom for 15 years in middle and high school, in special ed, and out in regular classrooms. And as I mentioned before, I once had a student come to me and say, this was in high school, can I tell you something, and it's a secret, and it was about an inappropriate exchange, or actually sexual activity between an adult and a student and her friend. I had an obligation to that. That was pretty clear cut, right? I actually legally I don't have much choice there, one way or the other. Which I told her, I said, I have to report this. I don't have a choice. But then I'm also reminded, and I'm curious, like, how you would suggest a teacher navigate something like this. I remember I was teaching middle school. This is in late 90s, so many, many years ago. And I had a student who I had assigned a detention or something like that. And she was, by all appearances, not, neglected or abused or depressed or showing any outward signs of emotional distress or anything like that. But it really struck me because she came to me after class. She was 7th grade, I think, maybe 8th grade. And she leaned over the desk and looked at me straight in the eyes and leaned over what I would describe as somewhat perhaps sexually suggestively, and looked at me right in the eyes and said, "Please don't give me detention. I'll do anything." And now I just said, well, I'm sorry, but that's the consequence, and we're moving on. But it struck me in the moment, and, shortly thereafter, it was like, that's scary for a couple of reasons. One, that if I'm reading the room right, that she has an understanding of how to use her body and sexuality, especially at that age, that way, manipulatively. But then also, what might be the worst alternative to detention, or to something that might be inappropriate, that she might be willing to do to avoid detention. What might be happening at home, and how might her mom or dad be punishing her for getting detention that might be some sort of abuse. And I didn't know. I have no idea, and still to this day, no idea really what the case was. I made some assumptions and certainly had some questions, but that might be something that you would say that's perhaps a sign that you might report, or ask more questions about.
I think both, and let me explain. I think you could explore, first of all, teachers sometimes are anxious about exploring that, but I do think if there's a counselor or someone that can explore it with the child and just find out how are things at home, if you could share that, this happened, and it seemed that you were very provocative, and we're just wondering if there's anything going on. But what I would suggest, and what I always tell people to do, is when you're not sure, but your gut says something isn't right, if you call the hotline or the state central register in your state, you can ask them questions, and you can say, look, this is what I experienced. It made me really uncomfortable. This child was sexually suggestive, and in my mind, way beyond the years of what she should have been doing at 12 years old. Mm-hmm. And what do you think? And those are the experts who then can guide because sometimes people think the second they call in, it's a report, but they will tell you what they think you should do as next steps.
Right.
That you're not left out there hanging, going home at night with this fear in your stomach. Oh, I should have made a report. I should have made a report. And they will say to you that, these are the steps you should take, or no, this is concerning behavior. Let's make a report so we can explore it. Or no, it doesn't rise to the incidence of making a report, but keep an eye on it. And maybe someone can talk to the child about, is there anything going, that, this is a safe place. I want to make sure that you are safe. In my mind, framing these conversations around safety is something that's really important for children and for adults, because I think that that's really what we want to do. We don't want to promise them that we're not going to make a report, but because that's your job. But I think calling the SCR and having a conversation about, does this rise and what's your advice? Because I'm concerned, and this was in my mind, sexual precocious knowledge beyond the years of the child, which is one of the things we look for in child sex abuse. The other thing that I would recommend for all teachers, and we do this all the time at the NYSPCC, is we do training for teachers, and actually we're really in the gymnast world too after the Larry Nassar's crisis, but training for teachers on how to recognize and report child sex abuse, because teachers are in that front line all the time. And what are they looking for? And in my mind, what you said is definitely a concerning symptom. So then it would be, who and how can you explore that with the child to get a better understanding? But also, as a backup, calling the state central register and telling them, if you don't have access to somebody else, I'm alarmed. What do you recommend? In my mind, is always the way to go. You err on the side of the child. You err on the side of the child's safety.
Yeah, I'm reading right now, and I'm a fan of, and actually really think it's important work that she's doing. Lenore Skenazy's book on free range children, and one of the things that she points out that I think is a complexity here. It's certainly different than you probably heard about some of the kids that are being you allow your kid to go to the playground by him or herself, or to travel in New York City on the subway or things like that, and police being called because that's being viewed as child abuse. And so there's as a teacher, as you mentioned, there is some anxiety of thinking, all right, what's my role here? And am I making or setting in action a series of steps that perhaps are going to be really a problem if in fact there's not any real issue in the home to be looking at. And so that is, I think, a real reality for teachers and parents and just people in general, but since we talk about education, to navigate that landscape, because that's tricky, right?
Yes, it is tricky, and the statistics bear it out. One in 10 children are going to be sexually abused by the time they're 18. So the onus is, in my mind, again, on the adults when they see concerning behaviors to try to get that child the support that they need. And it's hard, and people will be anxious. But I just think making the report and then letting people, where this is what they do for their job every day, take it over from there, will protect the child, will make the teacher feel less anxious, that they've done the right thing and they've taken the step. Because as the public poll showed, people are reticent about getting involved. And I think the thing that breaks my heart the most is when you watch the news at night and there's something bad that's happened to a child. They found a child almost dead, or they found a child dead, and then someone says, I thought something was going on, but I didn't make a report, and I wish I had gotten involved. And I think we all have to look out for the safety of children. And child sex abuse in particular, because there's so many feelings that the children are going through of fear and guilt and shame and anxiety. There's a lot of reasons why children don't come forward. And so if adult picks up signals that something is really off, it's really critical to try to get the support for that child.
Yeah.
It's in my mind, it's our obligation to try to help the child, but because the dynamics are so complex, and the majority, 90% of child sex abuse is by someone the child knows and trusts.
Mm-hmm.
As you pointed out, it could be going on in the home. Only 10% is stranger danger.
Mm-hmm.
So that with that 90% comes all sorts of really complicated emotions of why children don't come forward. So I really think in those cases, the onus is on the adults to absolutely try to not push it away, but to try to explore it and see if that child is in danger and needs help.
Yeah, well, and that's probably maybe a good ending point here. The erring on the side of caution, especially with children, seems to be the most reasonable default there. There's some other complexities of how those things are processed and handled, and even how people might perceive any questions about what might be going on in the home. I mean, I'm a divorced father and have 2 daughters myself, and one of the concerns that I had as we divorced was, will people allow their daughters to come over here for just to socialize and sleepovers, and trying to be very aware of that concern, or what I would have as a concern for my daughters going somewhere, and saying, ask me any questions that you feel uncomfortable with, because I want to be aware. I want you to know that this is okay. And matter of fact, I have in the other room, I think the girls are actually waking from their sleepover, their second sleepover of the night. So there are a number of roles and facets and understandings and some grace and some intentions, but as you mentioned, sort of erring on the side of caution and safety for the kids is, I can't imagine how anybody would say, well, that doesn't seem reasonable. So are there other, we'll put in the show notes, the nyspcc.org is the website that is associated with your organization. Other resources, we'll also mention the TeachThought blog that we have published, strategies, tips, and resources for protecting children from abuse, and we'll put that in the show notes as well. But anything else that you'd like to share, or places they should find you?
Well, please, share. My email is mpulido, Pulido, at nyspcc.org. So if people do have questions, feel free to email me. I think that the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children has great resources, and the no hit zone information. I think that's another great place for teachers to get resources to use. And in the blog, there was, I found I thought that the information that the Colorado Department of Human Services put out regarding like toolkits for teachers, and it actually covered like questions, implicit and explicit questions that teachers could ask if they have concerns about a child. And I thought that was really a very useful tool with the actual questions that the teachers might find helpful.
Great. Well, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate the conversation. Certainly an important topic. And if folks want to find any of the links, and they're on iTunes, where we cannot share live links that people can click on, they can go to the wegrowteachers.com, our website, and find this podcast and click on those links if they would like that information. So thanks again, Mary.
Thank you, Drew. Have a good day. Take care.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, teachthought.com and wegrowteachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.